Mars has always felt close. In the night sky, it looks calm, familiar, almost reachable. For centuries, people have looked at it and imagined that one day we would simply go there and stay. Today, that idea feels closer than ever. Rockets land themselves. Robots explore Mars daily. Plans are drawn. Timelines are announced. It feels like the next step is obvious. But there is a quiet problem hiding behind that confidence. Mars looks simple only from far away. The closer we get, the more complicated the story becomes. Living on Mars is often described as a future achievement, something we will grow into naturally as technology improves and experience accumulates over time. The reality is less smooth. Mars does not slowly become easier just because we study it more. In many ways, the more we learn, the harder long-term life there appears. To understand the next 100 years on Mars, we first need to step back. Not forward into the future, but backward into the planet's past. Water shaped its surface. Minerals formed in the presence of liquid water. The planet looked more Earth-like than most people imagine. This raises an obvious question that scientists still take seriously. If Mars had water, could it have supported life, even in a simple form? So far, no direct evidence of past life has been found. But the conditions that make life possible did exist for a time. Then something changed. Mars began to lose what made it active. Its interior cooled, its magnetic field weakened, its atmosphere slowly escaped into space. Without a strong magnetic field, solar radiation stripped away the atmosphere. With less air, water could not remain stable on the surface. Over immense time, Mars became quiet, cold, dry, not suddenly but gradually, through processes that follow known physics. This history matters because it explains the Mars we face today. A planet that once may have supported life, but no longer protects it. When people talk about living on Mars, they often imagine building on top of a dead but harmless world. That assumption is misleading. Mars is not neutral. It actively exposes anything on its surface to radiation, extreme cold, and a thin atmosphere that offers little protection. On Earth, our planet does enormous work in the background. It shields us, warms us, and balances conditions without effort from us. On Mars, none of that exists. Everything humans need must be built, powered, maintained, and never allowed to fail. This means that life on Mars would not feel like living on a new world. It would feel like surviving inside a machine placed on a hostile surface. Before we can ask what life on Mars will be like, we must ask a harder question. Can a place designed for survival ever become a place for living? That question does not have a simple answer. But the next 100 years on Mars will revolve around it. Not around flags, or first steps, or announcements. Around limits, trade-offs, and constant negotiation with an environment that never helps. Mars is close enough to dream about, yet far enough to punish mistakes. That tension defines everything that comes next. To understand Mars as a future home, we must first understand why it stopped being one long ago, and why returning life to its surface may be harder than we are ready to admit. At first glance, Mars looks calm and almost welcoming. Wide plains stretch to the horizon, mountains rise gently in the distance, and the light feels soft and familiar. From photos alone, it is easy to imagine humans landing, building shelters, and slowly settling in. That sense of calm is one of the most dangerous illusions Mars creates. Images hide what cannot be photographed easily. Radiation, pressure, and atmospheric protection do not appear in pictures. But they define what life on Mars would actually feel like. On Earth, danger usually announces itself clearly. Storms gather, temperatures shift, and weather changes rapidly. On Mars, danger does not arrive suddenly. It is present all the time, working quietly and without interruption. The Martian atmosphere is extremely thin, less than 1% of Earth's surface pressure. This is not just a breathing problem. It means the surface receives almost no protection from space itself. Earth's thick atmosphere absorbs radiation, smooths temperature changes, and protects living things from constant exposure. Mars lost most of that shield long ago, leaving its surface exposed to energetic particles. Short missions can tolerate some exposure. Long-term living cannot ignore it. Over decades, accumulated radiation becomes one of the most serious limits on human presence. Temperature adds another challenge that images rarely communicate. Mars can appear warm under sunlight, but heat escapes quickly once the sun sets. Without a thick atmosphere, temperatures swing sharply between day and night. Keeping indoor spaces stable would require constant energy and careful control. Air pressure creates an even stricter boundary. The human body cannot function safely at Martian surface pressure. Any habitat must remain sealed at all times. On Earth, small structural damage is inconvenient. On Mars, even a minor leak could become life-threatening within moments. There is no tolerance for error. Dust is another underestimated problem. Mars is famous for massive dust storms that can cover the entire planet and last for months. The dust is extremely fine and abrasive. It sticks to surfaces, works its way into machinery, and slowly degrades equipment. Robotic missions have already struggled with this problem. Solar-powered rovers have lost efficiency as dust accumulates and blocks sunlight. Now imagine that same dust interacting with human habitats, airlocks, suits, and life support systems every single day. Mars rarely destroys things quickly. Instead, it wears them down patiently. Components age faster. Maintenance never ends. This creates a life defined by constant upkeep. Living on Mars would mean continuously defending systems against an environment that never helps. The planet looks quiet, but it is not passive. It applies pressure continuously, testing every structure and every decision. This is why Mars feels simpler than it truly is. The danger is not dramatic enough to feel obvious, but it is always present. Understanding this reality changes how we should think about the next 100 years on Mars. Mars is not a blank world waiting for life to return. It is an environment that demands constant effort just to remain survivable. Before imagining long-term communities, we must first understand what daily survival actually requires. Because on Mars, survival is not the first step toward living. It is the challenge that never goes away. Water is the word that instantly changes how people think about Mars. The moment water is mentioned, the planet feels less dead and more familiar, almost inviting. For years, headlines have announced discoveries of water on Mars. Ancient riverbeds, dried lakes, polar ice, underground traces, all pointing to a wetter past. These discoveries matter, but they are often misunderstood. Water on Mars does not mean oceans waiting to be used. It means clues about what the planet used to be. Billions of years ago, Mars had liquid water flowing on its surface. Valleys were carved by rivers, and minerals formed only in the presence of water. This tells scientists that Mars once had conditions that could support simple life, at least for a limited time, early in its history. Plait has often explained that water alone does not guarantee life, but it is one of the basic requirements. Mars briefly met that requirement long ago. Over time, Mars lost its atmosphere and magnetic field. As pressure dropped, liquid water became unstable on the surface. Water did not disappear completely. It froze, evaporated, or became trapped underground. But it could no longer flow freely. Today, most of Mars's water exists as ice. Large amounts are locked in the polar caps and frozen beneath the surface. There may also be salty liquid water deep underground, but it would be extremely cold, briny, and difficult to access safely. This is where imagination often runs ahead of reality. Finding water is not the same as having usable water for humans. Extracting water on Mars would require drilling, heating, filtering, and constant energy input, all inside a hostile environment. Every step adds complexity. Equipment must function in cold, dust, and radiation, while being maintained by people in bulky suits. Even if water is extracted, it must be purified carefully. Martian soil contains chemicals that are dangerous for human biology. Using local water could help reduce supply missions from Earth. But it does not remove dependence on technology and energy. Water on Mars does not flow into homes or farms naturally. It must be forced into usefulness through machines that never stop working. There is also a scientific responsibility. If Mars once supported life, even simple life, contamination becomes a serious concern. Scientists are cautious about drilling too deeply or spreading Earth microbes that could confuse future discoveries. This creates a tension between exploration and preservation. Using Martian resources risks damaging the very evidence scientists want to study. Plait has noted that Mars teaches patience. Each discovery answers one question and raises several more. Water tells us Mars was once active and complex. It does not tell us that Mars is ready to host humans comfortably. In popular stories, water feels like a turning point. In reality, it is only the beginning of a long list of challenges. Water helps survival, but it does not create protection from radiation, cold, or pressure. The presence of water makes Mars scientifically fascinating, not biologically welcoming. For the next 100 years, water will shape how we explore Mars, not how easily we live there. Understanding this distinction keeps expectations grounded and plans realistic. Mars once had water, and that matters deeply. But living planets require more than memory. The search for life on Mars has shaped almost every major mission sent there. It is one of the oldest questions we ask when we look at another planet. This search is not driven by hope alone. It is guided by geology, chemistry, and comparisons with the early history of Earth. Scientists do not expect to find animals or plants. The focus has always been on simple life, such as microbes, that could survive harsh conditions. Plait has often explained that life does not need comfort. On Earth, it exists in extreme heat, cold, pressure, and chemical environments. Early Mars appears to have had water, energy sources, and stable conditions long enough for simple life to possibly emerge. That possibility is why rovers study ancient riverbeds, lake sediments, and minerals formed in water-rich environments. So far, no direct evidence of past or present life has been found. This absence is important, but it is not the same as proof of absence. Mars is old, dry, and exposed to radiation. If life ever existed near the surface, it may have been destroyed or erased over time. This is why current missions focus on ancient rocks that could preserve chemical signatures from billions of years ago. Finding life is difficult because Mars actively removes evidence. Radiation breaks down organic molecules, and dust constantly reshapes the surface. Even on Earth, ancient life is hard to detect. On Mars, the challenge is far greater due to its lack of protection. The possibility of underground life is also studied. Deep below the surface, conditions may be more stable and shielded from radiation. However, drilling deep enough to test this safely is extremely difficult with current technology. There is also a serious concern about contamination. Earth microbes are incredibly resilient and could survive on Mars temporarily. If Earth life spreads on Mars, it could permanently confuse future attempts to identify native Martian life. Because of this, space agencies follow strict rules to avoid contaminating the planet unnecessarily. This caution affects future human missions. Humans bring trillions of microbes wherever they go, despite best efforts to control them. Living on Mars would make it nearly impossible to keep the planet biologically clean. That does not mean humans should never go. It means scientific goals must be balanced against long-term presence. Plait has emphasized that Mars is both a destination and a laboratory. Once altered, some questions can never be answered again. The search for life shapes how we explore Mars, but it also limits how freely we can treat it as a future home. If Mars never had life, that result is still important. It tells us how rare life may be in the universe. If Mars once had life, even briefly, it changes how we understand planets, biology, and Earth itself. Either outcome matters enormously for science, but neither makes Mars easier to live on. In fact, the more carefully we search for life, the more cautious we must be about settlement. Mars challenges us to choose between discovery and occupation, at least for now. Understanding the tension keeps expectations honest and science intact. The first humans who set foot on Mars will not arrive to live normal lives. They will arrive to survive, observe, and leave behind the first fragile traces of human presence on another planet. Early missions will be short, carefully planned, and extremely limited in scope. Every action will be measured against risk, energy use, and the ability to return safely. Mars will not welcome mistakes. Supplies will be finite, communication delayed, and help impossible to send quickly. This alone shapes how people will behave there. The first habitats will feel less like homes and more like machines people live inside. Every wall, seal, and system will exist for survival, not comfort. Astronauts will spend much of their time maintaining life support systems rather than exploring. Keeping air, water, and power stable will be a daily priority. Plait has often noted that space missions succeed because of discipline, not heroics. Mars will amplify that truth more than any mission before it. Daily routines will be strict. Exercise to slow muscle and bone loss, system checks, data collection, and maintenance will fill most hours. Even simple tasks will take longer. Moving in pressurized suits is exhausting. Tools are harder to use. Every trip outside carries risk. Mars will feel isolating in a new way. Communication delays mean conversations with Earth will not happen in real time. Decisions must be made locally, without immediate guidance. That responsibility adds psychological pressure on top of physical stress. Sleep cycles will also be challenging. Mars has a day slightly longer than Earth's, which can disrupt natural rhythms over time. Small discomforts that feel manageable for weeks can become serious over months. Fatigue, stress, and monotony accumulate quietly. Food will be limited and repetitive. Early missions will rely heavily on prepackaged meals brought from Earth. Experiments with growing food may begin, but they will supplement supplies, not replace them for a long time. Every kilogram sent from Earth will be carefully justified. This limits variety, redundancy, and personal items. The surface of Mars will not be a place to wander freely. Dust, radiation, and terrain restrict movement to planned routes. Exploration will happen slowly and cautiously, often with robotic assistants leading the way. Living spaces will be small and shared. Privacy will be limited, and personal space tightly controlled. On Earth, isolation can be escaped. On Mars, it must be managed internally and socially within the group. The first crews will be selected not just for intelligence, but for resilience and cooperation under pressure. Conflicts will be dangerous, not emotionally, but operationally. Trust and coordination will be essential. These early missions will teach us how humans react to Mars, not how Mars reacts to humans. They will reveal weak points in systems, planning, and human limits that cannot be seen from Earth. Most importantly, They will show how difficult it is to turn survival into routine. The first humans on Mars will not build a society. They will test whether humans can remain functional at all. What they learn will shape every plan that follows for decades. The dream of long-term living will rest entirely on what these early missions reveal. Mars will not be conquered in the beginning. It will be negotiated with, carefully and humbly. And the outcome of that negotiation will determine what the next 100 years truly look like. Many people imagine that once the first base appears on Mars, growth will follow naturally. A base becomes 2, then 10, and eventually a city forms. History on Earth makes this idea feel reasonable. On Mars, that pattern breaks almost immediately. A base is not the seed of a city. It is a fragile island that survives only through constant external support. Cities on Earth grow because the environment allows expansion. Air, gravity, water, and protection already exist. On Mars, every expansion increases risk instead of reducing it. Each additional person requires more air, more water, more food, more power, and more protection from radiation. Growth multiplies complexity instead of spreading it out. Plait has often explained that space systems do not scale gracefully. What works for a few people becomes far harder to manage for many. On Earth, failure in one system can often be absorbed by others. In a Mars base, systems are tightly connected. A problem in one area affects everything. Power is a major limit. Solar energy is weaker on Mars, and dust reduces efficiency over time. Nuclear power helps, but adds complexity and responsibility. More people require more energy. But building larger power systems increases maintenance demands and failure risks in a harsh environment. Living space also becomes an issue. Expanding habitats means more pressure vessels, seals, and structural points that must never fail. On Earth, buildings can crack and weather slowly. On Mars, structures must remain perfect under pressure differences that never relax. Food production is often imagined as a solution to growth. In reality, growing food on Mars is resource-intensive and fragile. Plants need controlled light, water, nutrients, and protection. A small failure can destroy months of work and threaten supplies. This makes food systems vulnerable in ways that outdoor agriculture on Earth is not. Redundancy is required, which increases mass and cost. Psychology also limits growth. Small crews can be carefully selected and trained. Larger populations increase the chance of conflict and stress. Medical care is another constraint. Serious illness or injury cannot be treated fully on Mars. Evacuation is slow or impossible. As population grows, medical risk grows with it. This forces limits on who can be sent and how many can remain. Children change the equation entirely. Growth beyond small crews raises ethical and biological questions that have no tested answers. Education, development, and long-term health in low gravity are not solved problems. Cities assume generational continuity. Mars bases are designed for missions, not generations. Turning them into cities requires assumptions we cannot yet support. This is why realistic plans focus on outposts, not settlements. Presence, not population. For the next 100 years, Mars is more likely to host rotating crews than permanent communities. Growth will be slow, deliberate, and constrained by physics rather than ambition. Mars does not resist cities out of hostility. It resists them because it does not provide the conditions cities need to grow. Understanding this prevents disappointment and keeps planning grounded in reality. Bases on Mars are possible. Cities are a very different question. And that difference defines what the next century can realistically look like. Living on Mars becomes an even more complex question when time stretches beyond individual missions and into generations. At that point, survival is no longer the main issue. Continuity becomes the challenge. Short missions can rely on motivation, novelty, and a clear end date. Generational life removes all three. People are no longer visiting Mars, they are growing up there. Plait has often emphasized that humans are shaped as much by environment as by intention. Biology, psychology, and culture respond to surroundings whether we want them to or not. Mars offers a very narrow environment. Limited space, limited variation, and constant artificial control shape daily life from birth onward. Children born in such conditions would never experience open air, natural gravity, or an unfiltered environment. Their sense of normal would be fundamentally different. Low gravity raises unanswered biological questions. Human development evolved under Earth's gravity, and we do not yet know how reduced gravity affects growth over decades. Bones, muscles, balance, and organ development could all change in ways that are difficult to predict or reverse. Even if children adapt physically, returning to Earth could be dangerous or impossible for them. Mars-born humans may not be Earth-compatible. This introduces ethical questions that science alone cannot answer. Is it acceptable to create lives that are permanently dependent on a hostile environment? Psychology adds another layer. Choice matters deeply to mental health. Being born into confinement changes how freedom and identity are experienced. On Earth, people can change cities, climates, and lifestyles. On Mars, options would be extremely limited. Social tension is harder to release in closed environments. Conflicts cannot be escaped. They must be managed internally. Over time, small stresses accumulate. What feels manageable for adults on a mission may feel oppressive for someone who never chose that life. Culture would adapt. But adaptation does not remove strain. It simply changes how strain is expressed. Education, creativity, and emotional development depend on stimulation and variation. Mars offers very little of either naturally. Artificial environments can simulate some experiences, but simulation is not replacement. The brain knows the difference. This does not mean human life on Mars is impossible. It means it would be tightly constrained in ways Earth life is not. For the next 100 years, Mars is more likely to host rotating crews than permanent families. Generational settlement requires answers we do not yet have, and risks we do not fully understand. The question is not whether humans could be born on Mars, but whether they should be, given current knowledge. Mars challenges not only our technology, but our responsibility toward future lives. And that responsibility grows heavier the longer humans stay. When people imagine long-term life on Mars, they usually focus on courage, innovation, and advanced technology, while quietly overlooking economics, distance, and time. Even though these factors ultimately decide what can exist and what cannot. Mars is not simply far away in terms of kilometers. It is far in a way that reshapes planning itself, because distance turns small uncertainties into long-term risks that cannot be fixed quickly or cheaply once a mission is underway. Every kilogram sent to Mars requires immense energy, coordination, and funding. And that cost rises sharply as missions become longer, safer, and more complex, especially when humans are involved rather than robots. On Earth, supply chains adjust constantly. Delays are frustrating, but alternatives usually exist. On Mars, delays are unavoidable, alternatives are limited, and mistakes often persist for years before they can be corrected. If a critical system fails, replacement parts cannot arrive in days or weeks. They may arrive months later, if they arrive at all, which forces planners to build heavy redundancy into every system. Plait has often emphasized that space missions succeed not because of optimism, but because they are designed around failure. Mars amplifies this reality across every aspect of human presence. Economic systems on Earth rely on flexibility. Markets shift, resources move, and priorities change quickly. Mars offers no such adaptability because everything must be planned far in advance. A Mars base must function as a closed economic system, isolated from sudden funding changes, political shifts, or public interest fading back on Earth over time. Long timelines introduce political uncertainty as well. Governments change leadership, budgets shift direction, and national priorities evolve long before Mars missions reach maturity. Private investment faces similar limitations. There is no quick return on Mars, no natural consumer market, and no reliable path to profit that fits within short economic cycles. Mars does not offer resources that justify large-scale trade with Earth. Anything valuable enough to transport is almost always easier to obtain closer to home. This means Mars will remain economically dependent on Earth for a very long time, which places strict limits on population growth and expansion. Dependence creates fragility. A delayed launch, canceled program, or funding cut can ripple through Mars operations for years without easy recovery. Time also acts on infrastructure. Equipment ages, materials degrade under radiation, and systems designed for years must survive for decades without replacement. Replacing infrastructure on Mars is nothing like renovation on Earth. It requires launches, coordination, and planning measured in years rather than months. This slows adaptation. Design flaws persist longer, and improvements arrive slowly, even when problems are well understood. Communication delay adds another layer of pressure. Mars crews cannot rely on real-time guidance from Earth and must make critical decisions independently. Local autonomy increases responsibility and risk. Small teams carry the weight of choices that cannot be quickly reviewed or reversed. Economic constraints also shape priorities. Science, safety, comfort, and expansion compete constantly for limited mass, energy, and attention. Ambitious visions often assume continuous progress, but real Mars development will include pauses, setbacks, and reassessment. Over 100 years, even small inefficiencies accumulate into structural limits that cannot be ignored or wished away. This is why Mars progress will often feel slow from Earth. Not because of a lack of effort, but because physics and distance enforce patience. Mars does not allow rapid iteration. Every change must survive long testing cycles and real exposure before it can be trusted. Economics rarely appear in inspirational narratives, but they determine what survives once excitement fades. For the next century, Mars will advance through careful planning rather than momentum. Life there will be shaped as much by budgets and logistics as by science and engineering. Understanding this difference separates realistic futures from attractive timelines. When people talk about living on Mars, technology is often treated like a magic key that simply unlocks the future. Better tools, smarter machines, and stronger materials are expected to remove every serious obstacle. Technology absolutely matters, but it does not change the nature of Mars itself. It can reduce risk, slow damage, and buy time. But it cannot turn a hostile environment into a friendly one. Plait has often pointed out that technology works best when it cooperates with nature. On Mars, technology must constantly fight against natural conditions instead. Radiation shielding is a good example. Thicker walls and better materials can lower exposure, but they add mass, cost, and complexity that quickly become limiting. There is no perfect shield that blocks all radiation without trade-offs. Every solution shifts the problem rather than eliminating it. Artificial gravity is another popular idea. Spinning habitats sound elegant, but they introduce engineering challenges, uneven gravity, and motion sickness risks that remain unresolved. No large rotating habitat has ever supported humans long-term. The idea is promising, but it remains untested at the scale Mars living would require. Life support systems also inspire optimism. Recycling air and water works, but only with constant monitoring, maintenance, and replacement of worn components. These systems do not become self-sustaining over time. They become more fragile as parts age and margins shrink under continuous use. On Earth, ecosystems balance themselves naturally. On Mars, balance must be actively enforced by machines and people every single day. Robots are often proposed as a solution to human limits. Automation helps, but robots also require power, repairs, and human oversight. Mars robots already show how difficult maintenance can be. Dust, cold, and radiation slowly degrade even the simplest machines. More advanced technology usually means more complexity. Complexity increases the number of possible failure points, even when reliability improves. This creates a paradox. Technology makes survival possible, but it also increases dependence on systems that must never fail. Another common belief is that future breakthroughs will remove today's limits. History suggests otherwise. Progress usually reveals new constraints beneath old ones. Human biology does not upgrade with software. Bones, cells, and organs respond to physics the same way they always have. Technology can compensate for these limits, but only within boundaries. Those boundaries become clearer, not softer, with better data. Mars forces technology to operate without backup from nature. When something breaks, there is no environment to absorb the mistake. This is why space engineering is conservative. Proven systems are favored over elegant ideas that look good on paper. Mars rewards reliability over innovation speed. New technologies must survive long testing cycles before they can be trusted with lives. Popular visions often skip this slow phase. They imagine a leap from prototype to city, without the decades in between. In reality, Mars progress will be incremental. Improvements will be cautious, tested, and limited by accumulated experience. Technology will make Mars accessible, but not comfortable. It will enable presence, not remove hardship. The danger is not believing in technology. The danger is expecting it to change the rules instead of working within them. Mars does not negotiate with ambition. It responds only to physics, chemistry, and time. Understanding that difference is what separates engineering from fantasy. The idea of independence is central to almost every vision of humans living on Mars. The moment a place becomes independent, it feels permanent, stable, and no longer experimental. On Earth, independence usually emerges gradually. Communities grow, supply chains localize, and reliance on distant support slowly decreases over generations. On Mars, that path is far less forgiving. Independence does not emerge naturally from presence. It must be engineered deliberately against an environment that resists it. Every system on Mars depends on energy. Power generation, storage, and distribution are the backbone of survival, and failures cascade quickly through all other systems. Solar power is weaker on Mars than on Earth, and dust storms reduce efficiency unpredictably. This forces large margins and backup systems that add complexity. Nuclear power offers stability, but it introduces its own challenges. Reactors require protection, maintenance, and long-term responsibility that cannot be ignored. True independence would require Mars to produce not just energy, but spare parts, tools, and replacement systems locally and reliably. Manufacturing on Mars sounds achievable in theory, but in practice it demands precision, materials processing, and quality control under difficult conditions. On Earth, factories rely on massive supply networks. On Mars, every missing component becomes a potential mission-ending problem. Plait has often noted that space systems struggle not because ideas are bad, but because real-world execution exposes countless dependencies. Even something as simple as a broken valve or worn seal can become critical if replacements are unavailable locally. Autonomy also applies to decision-making. Mars crews cannot depend on real-time guidance from Earth due to communication delays. This forces local authority, but also increases pressure. Mistakes cannot be quickly reviewed or corrected by distant experts. Independence requires redundancy, but redundancy increases mass, power use, and maintenance demands, creating a difficult balancing act. Medical autonomy is one of the hardest challenges. Serious injuries or illnesses cannot be fully treated without Earth-level facilities. A truly independent Mars would require advanced medical capabilities that are extremely difficult to support in a small, isolated population. Food independence is often imagined as a breakthrough point. In reality, agriculture on Mars remains resource-intensive and fragile. Closed-loop food systems must operate perfectly over long periods. Small failures can quickly become major shortages. Even if food production improves, nutritional variety and resilience remain limited compared to Earth's ecosystems. Independence also depends on people. Skills must overlap, knowledge must be preserved, and training must continue across generations. On Earth, expertise spreads through large populations. On Mars, losing a few key individuals can create serious gaps. Cultural independence brings another layer. Values, priorities, and social structures would evolve differently under constant constraint. That evolution may support survival, but it does not remove dependence on Earth for knowledge, materials, or connection. For the next 100 years, Mars is unlikely to become truly independent in any meaningful sense. Instead, it will exist in a long-term relationship with Earth, defined by support, exchange, and limitation. This does not make Mars less important, makes its role clearer and more honest. Mars will teach humanity how far cooperation, planning, and restraint can go beyond Earth. Independence is not a switch that flips. On Mars, it is a moving target that retreats as fast as we approach it. Understanding this prevents unrealistic expectations and focuses effort where it matters most. Mars may host humans, but Earth will remain the foundation beneath every step taken there. And that reality shapes what the next century can truly support. When the technical challenges of Mars are discussed long enough, a deeper question inevitably appears. If living there is so difficult, uncomfortable, and constrained, why would people choose to stay at all? On Earth, motivation is supported by variety. People change careers, environments, and lifestyles. They seek meaning through movement and choice. Mars offers very little of that flexibility. Life on Mars would not reward spontaneity. It would reward consistency, patience, and adherence to routines that protect shared systems and reduce risk for everyone involved. Plait has often emphasized that space exploration succeeds because people accept limits, not because they ignore them. Mars would demand that mindset every day, not just during missions. This changes how purpose is defined. Meaning would not come from expansion or personal freedom, but from contribution to stability and long-term survival. Daily life would revolve around maintaining systems that never stop demanding attention. Purpose would be practical, not abstract or romantic. For some people, that structure could feel deeply meaningful. Being necessary, reliable, and trusted can provide strong psychological satisfaction. For others, the same structure could feel suffocating over time. Limited choice and constant responsibility can slowly erode motivation. On Earth, dissatisfaction often leads to change. On Mars, dissatisfaction must be managed internally because leaving is not simple or quick. This places enormous importance on culture. Shared values, conflict resolution, and collective identity would determine whether life feels bearable or oppressive. Celebration, creativity, and ritual would matter more than comfort. They would provide emotional release in an environment that offers little natural variation. Mars culture would likely value responsibility over ambition, cooperation over individuality, and preservation over growth. That cultural shift would not happen instantly. It would emerge slowly as people adapt to the realities of long-term confinement. Motivation would also depend on connection to Earth. Communication delays limit immediacy, but emotional ties remain essential for mental health. Cutting Mars off completely would increase isolation and risk burnout. Staying connected maintains perspective and emotional grounding. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Mars is not a place people stay because it feels good. They stay because the mission feels necessary. Purpose on Mars would come from knowing that effort matters, even when comfort is absent and progress is slow. That kind of motivation is powerful, but it is also fragile. It requires constant reinforcement and honest expectations. Romanticizing life on Mars risks breaking that motivation when reality does not match imagination. Honest storytelling does the opposite. It prepares people for difficulty and makes endurance meaningful rather than disappointing. The next 100 years on Mars will depend less on technology than on whether humans can sustain purpose under constraint. Living there will test not just engineering, but the reasons people choose to endure hardship at all. Mars is often described as humanity's backup plan, a second home waiting for us if Earth ever becomes unlivable. This idea sounds reassuring, especially during times of crisis, but it collapses quickly when examined through science rather than emotion. On Earth, the concept of a backup works because environments already support life. Cities can move, borders can change, and people can adapt within a living system that constantly repairs itself. Mars offers no such foundation. Calling Mars a Plan B assumes that life there could function independently. But everything on Mars depends on uninterrupted support, constant maintenance, and precise engineering that must never fail for long. Plait has often stressed that Earth is not just where we live, but why we can live at all. Its atmosphere, magnetic field, gravity, and ecosystems work together in ways no technology can fully replicate. Mars lacks those systems entirely. Any human presence there exists inside artificial bubbles that must fight the environment every second of every day. A backup plan must be resilient. Mars is not resilient. It is fragile by design, because survival depends on machines that degrade over time and require resources brought from another planet. Even small disruptions on Earth can be absorbed by scale and redundancy. On Mars, disruptions compound because scale is limited and redundancy is expensive. The idea of Mars as a refuge also ignores population realities. Earth supports billions of people naturally. Mars could support only a tiny fraction, even under optimistic assumptions. This raises a difficult but necessary question. A plan that saves a few while leaving most behind is not a backup for humanity as a whole. Mars exploration teaches us many valuable lessons, but replacing Earth is not one of them. Instead, Mars shows how rare and delicate Earth-like conditions truly are. The more we study Mars, the clearer it becomes that planets do not recover easily once they lose habitability. Mars did not fail suddenly. It faded slowly, and it never returned. That history is a warning, not an invitation. It shows what happens when a planet loses the systems that protect life over long periods. Seeing Mars as a backup shifts attention away from protecting Earth, which remains the only place that supports complex life without constant intervention. Plait has often argued that space exploration should deepen our appreciation for Earth, not encourage the illusion that we can simply leave when things get hard. Mars is not a lifeboat waiting nearby. It is a harsh environment that tolerates human presence only briefly and conditionally. Understanding this reframes the purpose of Mars entirely. It becomes a place of learning, perspective, and humility rather than escape. The danger of the Plan B narrative is not scientific error alone. It is psychological comfort that delays responsibility. Believing there is an easy alternative weakens the urgency to protect what already works. Mars does not promise rescue. It offers contrast. It shows us what life looks like when planetary support is removed. That contrast makes Earth's value clearer than any speech or slogan ever could. The next 100 years on Mars will not decide humanity's survival. Earth already has. Mars will simply remind us of that fact again and again through silence and resistance. And if we listen carefully, that lesson may be the most important one Mars has to offer. If Mars cannot realistically become a true home for humanity, then a natural question follows. Why do we keep going there at all? And what does Mars actually give us in return? Mars is valuable not because it promises comfort, but because it removes illusion. It shows us what happens when planetary support systems disappear, and life must rely entirely on intention and design. Every mission to Mars forces engineers and scientists to confront limits honestly. There is no room for vague optimism when distance, time, and physics make every mistake expensive. Plait has often pointed out that Mars teaches clarity. It strips away storytelling and replaces it with measurable constraints that must be understood, not negotiated with. Studying Mars helps us understand climate change in a deeper way. Mars lost its atmosphere and water slowly, through processes that followed physical laws we can observe. By comparing Mars and Earth, scientists learn how fragile planetary balance really is, and how difficult it is to restore once it is lost. Mars also expands our understanding of life itself. Even if no life is ever found there, that absence tells us something important about how rare life may be. If Mars once had conditions suitable for life and still failed to sustain it, that fact reshapes how we think about biology across the universe. Technologically, Mars pushes human capability forward. Systems built for Mars must be efficient, reliable, and resilient in ways that benefit technology back on Earth. Water recycling, energy efficiency, automation, and remote medicine all improve because Mars demands solutions that work with minimal margin for error. Mars also reshapes how humans think about cooperation. Missions require long-term planning across nations, institutions, and generations. No single group can manage Mars alone. Its scale forces collaboration and exposes the cost of fragmentation and competition. Psychologically, Mars reframes exploration. It replaces conquest with stewardship and patience, values that are often undervalued in modern culture. The planet rewards preparation and humility, rather than speed or boldness, challenging how progress is usually measured. Mars also gives humanity perspective. Seeing a world that once changed irreversibly reminds us that planetary futures are not guaranteed. This perspective is not abstract. It feeds directly into how we think about Earth, sustainability, and long-term responsibility. Mars does not distract from Earth's problems when understood correctly. It sharpens them, showing what failure looks like when recovery is no longer possible. The danger comes when Mars is misunderstood as an escape rather than a lesson. That misunderstanding weakens the value Mars actually offers. Properly framed, Mars is not about leaving Earth behind. It is about understanding what makes Earth work while we still can protect it. The next 100 years of Mars exploration will likely be slow, deliberate, and limited in scale, but rich in insight. Human presence there will be symbolic as much as practical, reminding us of both our reach and our limits. Mars will never welcome us. but it will teach us, repeatedly and clearly, if we are willing to listen. And what it teaches may matter far more than whether we ever call it home. When Mars stops being imagined as a future home and starts being understood as a mirror, it changes how humanity thinks about progress itself. The focus shifts from expansion to evaluation, from movement to meaning. For a long time, the future was pictured as outward motion. New lands, new worlds, and new beginnings were seen as proof that problems could always be left behind. Mars quietly challenges that idea. It shows that moving outward does not remove limits, but often exposes them more clearly and more harshly. Plait has often emphasized that space is honest in a way Earth is not. It does not soften consequences or hide mistakes behind abundance and recovery. When Mars is viewed honestly, it reframes success. Success becomes the ability to operate responsibly within limits, rather than the ability to escape them. This perspective affects how we think about technology. Tools are no longer symbols of domination, but instruments of balance and restraint. Mars reminds us that complexity does not guarantee safety. In many cases, simpler, well-understood systems outperform elegant but fragile designs. That lesson extends beyond space. It applies to energy, infrastructure, and environmental management back on Earth as well. Seeing Mars as a mirror also changes how we think about time. Progress slows down, but understanding deepens. Mars forces patience. It rewards long planning cycles, careful testing, and acceptance that some problems take generations to fully understand. This runs against modern expectations of rapid solutions and constant acceleration. Mars resists speed in every form. As a result, it encourages a different kind of optimism. Not optimism based on inevitability, but optimism based on responsibility and learning. Mars does not promise that humanity will thrive anywhere it chooses. It asks whether humanity can thrive when conditions are difficult and unforgiving. That question reshapes ambition. Ambition becomes quieter, more deliberate, and more grounded in evidence rather than belief. It also reshapes identity. Humans are no longer framed as conquerors of worlds, but as temporary guests in environments that do not need them. This shift can feel uncomfortable. It removes flattering narratives and replaces them with accountability. But it also creates clarity. Knowing where limits are allows effort to be focused where it can actually succeed. Mars shows that the future is not guaranteed by movement alone. It depends on how well we understand systems and protect what sustains us. When Mars is treated as a mirror, Earth comes into sharper focus. Its stability, diversity, and resilience become more visible and more valuable. This does not diminish the value of exploration. It gives it direction and purpose beyond spectacle. The future of humanity may not be defined by where we go next, but by what we learn when we look carefully at places like Mars. In that sense, Mars is not a destination at all. It is a question we keep asking ourselves from a distance. Imagine standing inside a Mars habitat late at night, when most systems are quiet and only background hum remains. Outside, the planet is silent, cold, and completely indifferent to human presence. That silence is not poetic. It is informative. Mars never reacts to us emotionally. It does not care about effort, hope, or ambition. It responds only to physics and time. This changes how progress feels. On Earth, effort is often rewarded quickly. On Mars, effort is measured in prevention rather than achievement. A successful day on Mars might look like nothing happened. No alarms, no failures, no emergencies. Survival itself becomes the achievement. Plait has often highlighted that in space, boredom is a sign of success. excitement usually means something went wrong. This flips the usual storytelling of exploration. There are no dramatic victories, only long stretches of careful maintenance and quiet endurance. Over decades, that rhythm shapes people differently. Attention shifts from goals to systems, from dreams to details. Small routines become anchors. Checking pressure, monitoring power, cleaning filters. These actions quietly keep everyone alive. In this environment, patience becomes a survival skill, not a personality trait. Impulsiveness becomes dangerous rather than inspiring. Mars would reward people who notice subtle changes. A strange sound, a delayed response, a small deviation in data. That sensitivity builds a different kind of intelligence. Less about speed, more about awareness and restraint. Over 100 years, this mindset would influence how missions are designed. Fewer bold leaps, more careful steps. Technology would evolve not toward spectacle, but toward reliability and predictability under stress. Mars would also reshape how humans think about failure. Failure would not be dramatic collapse, but slow erosion if ignored. This encourages humility. People learn quickly that they are guests in an environment that does not adjust to them. Stories from Mars would likely be quiet stories, about problems avoided rather than disasters survived. Back on Earth, those stories might feel underwhelming. But they would represent a deep shift in how success is defined. Mars would teach that endurance is more valuable than conquest, and preparation more important than confidence. That lesson does not stay on Mars. It filters back into how humanity approaches other challenges. Climate systems, infrastructure, and long-term planning on Earth all benefit from this slower, more cautious mindset. Mars becomes a training ground for thinking at planetary timescales rather than human impatience. Even if no cities rise, no generations are born there, Mars still changes us. It changes how we judge progress, how we measure success, and how seriously we take limits. After 100 years of human presence, Mars would not look like a new Earth, and it would not resemble the cities imagined in early science fiction. Its surface would still appear vast, quiet, and mostly untouched from orbit. The most visible signs of humanity would be small and scattered. Landing sites, tracks in the soil, abandoned equipment, and a few carefully maintained habitats would mark human activity rather than dominate the landscape. Mars would not be transformed by people. Instead, people would be transformed by Mars, learning how limited their influence truly is on a planetary scale. Plait has often emphasized that planets are shaped by deep time, not short bursts of activity. A century is meaningful to humans, but barely noticeable to a world like Mars. Human structures would age quickly under radiation, dust, and temperature extremes. Even well-designed systems would require constant attention to remain functional. Some early habitats would likely be retired, sealed, or left behind as technology improves, creating a quiet archaeological record of trial and error. Mars would become layered with human history, not through expansion, but through accumulation of experience and adjustment. Robotic exploration would continue alongside human missions, often outperforming them in endurance and reach, extending knowledge far beyond human footprints. Human presence would likely remain concentrated in a few carefully chosen regions rather than spread across the planet. These regions would be selected not for beauty or symbolism, but for engineering practicality and access to resources. Over time, Mars would become less mysterious, but not less hostile. Familiarity would reduce uncertainty, not danger. People would learn how Mars fails systems, how it stresses materials, and how it quietly erodes margins over long periods. This knowledge would be invaluable, even if it does not lead to permanent settlement. Mars would serve as a reference point, a place where humanity tested its limits without illusions. Back on Earth, Mars would influence how long-term projects are planned, how risk is managed, and how patience is valued. Lessons learned there would shape space exploration far beyond Mars itself. They would inform missions to asteroids, moons, and deep space observatories where similar constraints apply. After 100 years, Mars would not feel conquered or owned. It would feel understood, at least partially. That understanding would replace early fantasies with respect and realism. Mars would remain a place humans visit with care, not a place they dominate. Its value would lie not in population numbers, but in perspective gained. The planet would stand as evidence that exploration does not always lead to settlement. Sometimes, exploration leads to wisdom instead. And over a century, that wisdom may prove to be Mars's greatest contribution to humanity. Even after understanding how difficult Mars truly is, humanity keeps returning to the same idea again and again. The planet continues to attract attention, funding, and imagination. Not because it promises comfort, but because it represents something deeper in human psychology. Mars sits in a unique position between familiarity and alienness. It looks like a world that almost worked, a place that feels close enough to understand, yet distant enough to remain mysterious. That balance is incredibly powerful for the human mind. Plait has often noted that curiosity does not fade simply because answers become inconvenient. In fact, difficult truths often deepen curiosity rather than extinguish it, especially when they challenge our assumptions. Mars forces us to confront a version of ourselves stripped of protection. There is no background safety, no forgiving environment, and no natural recovery. Everything depends on intention, planning, and discipline. This confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. It reveals how much of modern life depends on invisible support systems we rarely think about on Earth. Mars attracts us because it exposes fragility without drama. There are no storms of fire or constant explosions, just quiet pressure that never stops testing every decision. That kind of challenge appeals to a certain human instinct. Not the desire to conquer, but the desire to understand limits and see how far preparation and care can carry us. Mars also serves as a shared symbol. Different cultures, nations, and generations project their hopes and fears onto the same distant world. For some, Mars represents progress. For others, it represents warning. For many, it represents the unknown future made tangible. Unlike distant exoplanets, Mars is close enough to touch with machines and possibly people. It exists within reach, but not within control. That tension keeps it relevant. Mars never becomes solved. Each answer creates new questions rather than closing the story. Over time, Mars stops being about the planet itself and becomes about humanity's relationship with uncertainty. Do we rush forward, or do we proceed carefully? Do we listen to limits, or try to overpower them? Mars reflects those choices back to us. This is why Mars remains compelling even when optimism fades. It does not offer easy victories, but it offers clarity. It challenges the idea that survival equals success. It asks whether endurance, responsibility, and restraint can also be forms of achievement. Mars does not inspire because it is welcoming. It inspires because it is honest. And honesty, especially at a planetary scale, has a way of drawing us back again and again. When humans imagine the next 100 years on Mars, they often picture dramatic milestones. First landings, permanent bases, maybe even the first generation born away from Earth. But history suggests that the most important changes rarely look dramatic while they are happening. The real transformation would occur quietly, through habits, procedures, and expectations slowly reshaped by the Martian environment. Mars would not change humanity through spectacle, but through repetition and constraint. Every decision on Mars carries weight because consequences linger. A shortcut that works once may fail months later. A small oversight may not matter immediately, but it can accumulate into serious risk over time. Plait has often pointed out that space teaches delayed consequences. In space, problems rarely announce themselves loudly. They emerge gradually, through patterns that only careful observation reveals. This would force a cultural shift in how humans plan and think. Short-term thinking becomes dangerous. Long-term thinking becomes necessary for survival rather than optional. On Earth, mistakes are often cushioned by redundancy and scale. On Mars, mistakes teach quickly and unforgivingly, even when outcomes are not immediately catastrophic. Over decades, this environment would shape decision-making back on Earth as well. Mars-trained thinking values patience, verification, and humility over speed and confidence. Engineering philosophies would evolve. Designs would prioritize repairability, simplicity, and resilience rather than peak performance or elegance. Scientific planning would also change. Experiments would be designed with failure in mind, knowing that repetition and adjustment are more realistic than perfect execution. Mars would encourage a mindset where progress is measured by stability rather than expansion. Holding systems together becomes more important than pushing boundaries. This runs counter to how progress is often marketed. Mars would quietly undermine the idea that bigger, faster, and newer are always better. Instead, it would reward endurance. Systems that function reliably for years would be celebrated more than systems that promise revolutionary change. This influence would extend beyond space exploration. Infrastructure planning, environmental management, and disaster preparation on Earth would benefit from lessons learned on Mars. Mars would become a proving ground not for dominance, but for discipline. Not for conquest, but for careful coexistence with limits. The planet would teach that survival in extreme environments is not about heroism, but about consistency applied over long periods. Over 100 years, this lesson would repeat itself through every mission, every design choice, and every near failure avoided. Mars would slowly shift how humanity defines intelligence, competence, and success under pressure. Not through speeches or declarations, but through quiet evidence accumulated over time. In that sense, Mars would shape humanity even if it never hosts large populations or permanent cities. Its influence would spread not through settlement, but through thinking. And that influence may prove far more lasting than footprints in the dust. Even after 100 years of experience, planning, and technological improvement, Mars would still resist becoming a place of comfort. The reason is simple, but often ignored. Comfort is not something technology adds easily when the environment itself works against life. On Earth, comfort emerges naturally from stability. Gravity supports our bodies, air protects us, and ecosystems absorb mistakes quietly. Mars offers none of these advantages, which means comfort must be actively manufactured at all times. Plait has often pointed out that space does not gradually become friendly through familiarity. It becomes predictable, but predictability does not remove danger or effort. It only clarifies where the risks remain. Over decades, systems on Mars would improve. Habitats would become safer, routines more efficient, and failures less frequent. But none of that would remove the need for constant vigilance. Every improvement would trade one difficulty for another. Thicker shielding increases safety, but adds mass. More automation reduces workload, but increases dependence on software and power stability. Comfort on Earth allows attention to drift. On Mars, attention must remain sharp. A moment of neglect can undo months of careful planning. This difference shapes daily life profoundly. Mars residents would never fully relax in the way people do on Earth. Awareness would always sit in the background. That persistent awareness creates fatigue, not dramatic exhaustion, but a quiet, cumulative mental load that builds over time. Mars would reward those who accept this state rather than fight it. People who expect ease would struggle far more than those who expect effort. Popular visions often assume that technology eventually removes hardship. Mars demonstrates that technology usually relocates hardship instead. Climate control removes cold but introduces power dependency. Pressurization removes vacuum but introduces structural risk. Protection always comes with cost. Even leisure on Mars would feel different. Recreation would occur inside sealed environments, constrained by safety and resource limits. Nature on Earth restores attention and reduces stress. Mars has no natural equivalent. Artificial spaces can imitate, but not fully replace, that effect. Over a century, Mars would teach humans to redefine comfort. Comfort would mean stability, reliability, and predictability rather than ease or abundance. That redefinition would slowly influence expectations back on Earth as well, especially in environments already under stress. Mars would remind humanity that comfort is not guaranteed by progress alone. It is produced by alignment between biology and environment. On Mars, that alignment never fully exists. It must be constantly enforced through effort. This does not make Mars a failure. It clarifies its role. Mars is a place of work, not rest, of learning, not retreat. Even after 100 years, Mars would remain a place where survival is conditional and comfort is limited. The dream does not disappear, but it changes shape. It becomes quieter, more realistic, and less romantic. And that change may be one of the most valuable outcomes Mars can offer. Mars quietly forces humanity to reconsider what progress actually means. For a long time, progress was measured by speed, expansion, and visible achievement. Bigger projects, faster movement, and dramatic milestones defined success. On Mars, that definition fails almost immediately. Speed becomes risk. Expansion becomes fragility. Dramatic milestones often hide long-term weaknesses that only appear later when correction is difficult or impossible. Plait has often explained that space rewards caution more than confidence. Mars amplifies this lesson by making every shortcut expensive and every assumption dangerous over time. Progress on Mars would be measured in avoided failures rather than celebrated breakthroughs. A year without serious incidents would matter more than a new record or headline. This flips the emotional reward system humans are used to. Success becomes quiet and almost invisible, while mistakes demand attention and energy. On Earth, progress often feels like acceleration. On Mars, progress feels like stabilization. Holding systems steady over long periods becomes the primary goal. This mindset values durability over novelty. Technologies that last 10 years without failure become more impressive than innovations that promise radical change but add fragility. Mars would encourage long-term thinking in a way few environments can. Decisions would be evaluated not by immediate payoff, but by how they perform years later. This would slowly influence how humans plan complex systems elsewhere. Infrastructure, climate planning, and risk management on Earth would absorb these lessons. Mars shows that growth without resilience is not progress. It is simply movement toward failure, delayed by luck. Another uncomfortable lesson Mars teaches is that some limits are permanent. No amount of optimism removes gravity differences, radiation exposure, or distance. Progress, then, becomes the art of working within limits rather than trying to erase them. That is a harder, more disciplined definition. Mars strips away the illusion that technology automatically leads to freedom. Instead, it shows how technology often increases responsibility. More systems mean more dependencies. More automation means more points of failure that must be understood and maintained. This realization reshapes ambition. Ambition becomes less about conquest and more about stewardship under pressure. Mars also challenges the idea that humanity must always move outward to advance. Sometimes, understanding and preserving what exists is the greater achievement. The planet offers no applause for effort. It responds only to outcomes. Systems work or they fail. That neutrality forces honesty. Plans must be grounded in evidence, not belief. Confidence must be supported by preparation. Over 100 years, this approach would redefine expertise. The most respected individuals would be those who prevent problems before they appear. Progress would be seen not as a straight line forward, but as a careful balance maintained against constant pressure. Mars teaches that maturity, not expansion, may be the true marker of an advanced civilization. That lesson is not exciting in the usual sense, but it is deeply important. And it may be one of the hardest lessons humanity has ever had to learn. After tracing 100 years of imagined presence on Mars, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. Mars does not reject humanity out of hostility or indifference. It rejects shortcuts, illusions, and stories that ignore how life actually works under physical limits. Everything Mars teaches points back to a simple truth. Life is not defined by where it goes, but by the conditions that allow it to persist without constant struggle. Earth provides those conditions naturally. Mars does not and never truly will. Plait has often emphasized that space exploration is valuable not because it promises escape, but because it offers perspective. Mars gives that perspective with unusual clarity, stripping away comfort and revealing dependence we usually forget. Over a century, Mars would not become a second Earth. It would become a long-term experiment in restraint, responsibility, and patience. Human presence there would remain conditional, carefully maintained, and always aware of fragility. This does not diminish the importance of Mars. It elevates it. Mars becomes a place where humanity learns how to operate honestly within limits, rather than pretending limits do not exist. The most lasting change would not be physical structures on the Martian surface. It would be a shift in mindset carried back to Earth, influencing how humans plan, protect, and value complex systems. Mars would quietly teach that survival is not guaranteed by ambition alone. It depends on cooperation, preparation, and respect for environments that do not adapt to us. The dream of living on Mars does not disappear. It matures. It becomes less about permanence and more about presence. Less about ownership and more about understanding.